All right, and I'll start sharing my screen. All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Joy. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. Really excited actually to talk to all of you, including the discussion afterwards, if there's time for that, just because I know that we are really all going to need to be working together even more in this next few years, particularly, and definitely really interested in reaching out to Oregon and figuring out ways that we can all work together on some of these issues that the orcas are facing. So, really happy to be here today. So I am kind of going under the premise that most of you probably know sort of the basics about orcas. So I'm going to skip that part. But if there are any questions, please do not hesitate to ask, or if there's anything that you need a little bit more clarification on. And then some of the other things as well that I'm talking about today, I might sort of gloss over just with the assumption that you're probably fairly aware. But again, don't hesitate to ask any questions if there's something that you want more clarification on. All right, so just starting out with Orca Network, in case you're not familiar with them, this is the organization that I work for, and we do a number of different programs. Orca Network is based on Whidbey Island in Washington, and we do all of these programs. I won't go into great detail on this, but we have a whale sighting network, which is where some of you might come in because we do collect whale sighting information, and that gets disseminated out to the public so they can go out and watch whales from shore. It is shared with researchers, policymakers. So it's just kind of a huge database that is shared where it needs to go. And we're also part of the Quiet Sound program, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But Quiet Sound is collecting information about southern residents in Puget Sound and then sharing that information with voters, with particularly shipping traffic, so that they are aware that orcas are close by and they can slow down or do whatever they need to do. So the sighting network is really participating in that. They actually, whenever southern residents are around, they're inputting the data every 15 minutes into the quiet sound information. And southern residents were actually just in Puget Sound for 28 days straight. They just left yesterday. So that was a lot of data every 15 minutes during daylight hours for 28 days. So as part of the sighting network, we also do boater education and awareness to try to teach people, just how to operate responsibly. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, so I'm losing my voice a little bit. Hopefully it'll hang out. Toki's legacy, we'll talk a little bit more about Tokite if you're not as familiar with her. It used to be called the Free Tokite program, and now we've changed it to Toki's legacy. And again, I'll mention her a little bit later. We have a marine mammal stranding network for Whidbey Island and the surrounding areas. We have a whale center on Whidbey Island. And then there's the education and advocacy program, which is the one without a logo, but that's what I do for Orca Network. And then I also want to mention that the information I'm going to be sharing with you today, none of it is my information. It's a lot of data that's collected by a lot of really amazing research groups. So we have a lot of partners that we work with, both with research and data sharing, but also in our advocacy work and our education work. And this is just a snapshot of some of the partners that we work with. So a lot of the information I'm sharing with you today is from the research organizations who are here. And then we also have some alliances and coalitions that we're part of where we work together on issues. So I just kind of wanted to give a shout out to all the great organizations out there that we are very fortunate to be able to work with. All right. So again, I'm just going to kind of skip the basics on orcas and get into a little bit more of some of the issues and the research and some of the recovery efforts that have been going on. And again, I'll mention I am on San Juan Island. It's a little blustery here today, so internet isn't always great here. So if for some reason I'm like skipping a little bit, if I'm going in and out, maybe the slides aren't moving as well as they should, just let me know. Just jump in and let me know, and I can turn off my video, and then hopefully that will help. So I'm just going to kind of give a little bit of a brief overview that you're probably fairly aware of the three different ecotypes of orcas that we have in the Pacific Northwest. So the offshores are the ones that we generally don't see very often because they're typically further offshore, although they do sometimes wander in a little bit closer. So I wanted to mention them. They do range from Southern California to the Aleutian Islands, again, typically further offshore, but sometimes wandering closer. Generally in pretty big pods. They are fish eaters, primarily sharks, particularly Pacific sleeper sharks. That's a big part of their diet. And the population estimate is around 300 individuals. Then we have the West Coast transients, also known as the bigs. They were called transient because they weren't seen very often back in the day, and they wandered in and out a lot. And so that's how they got the name transient. But particularly here where I am in the Salish Sea, they're not transient anymore. We're seeing them pretty much every day. So a lot of people are calling them Biggs orcas now in honor of Dr. Michael Bigg. They range from Southern California to Southeast Alaska, generally travel in smaller matrilines, but they will get together in really big groups. We've had some groups of 20 to 30 Biggs orcas traveling together. So we used to say that you could tell, whether you've got Biggs or residents by pod size or group size, and that's not necessarily the case anymore. They eat exclusively marine mammals. The West Coast Biggs population is about 600 individuals. The coastal bigs, which are the ones that we would typically see off the coast, where the ones that you're probably seeing off Oregon, the ones we're seeing in the Salish Sea, and that population is kind of a subset. It's about 350 plus. And then we have the resident orchids, of course. And there are three populations: the northern, the southern, and the Alaskan. The southern residents, who obviously we're concentrating on today, range from Monterey to Southeast Alaska. They generally travel in larger pods or matrilines, although again, sometimes we will just get one or two matrilines showing up together. So pod or matriline size doesn't necessarily tell us which ecotype we're looking at any longer. They eat exclusively fish, primarily salmon, although they are eating some other species, according to the latest research. And the northern resident population is 300 plus. Southern residents are currently listed as 73 individuals. So we have these three very different ecotypes. There was a paper that came out this year that was looking at genetics of orcas and actually made a very good case for residents and Biggs orcas being so genetically distinct from other orcas worldwide that they should be classified as different species. So there was a proposal to do that. So there would have been three species of orcas. There would have been the residents, the Biggs, and then all other orcas worldwide. So that was sent to the Society of Marine Mammalogy. They decided that at this time they weren't going to separate them. So they are still listed as the same species right now, but they are kind of listed as subspecies. But they are very, very different. They don't intermingle. They don't interbreed. Residents and Biggs have been genetically distinct for hundreds of thousands of years. They have different diets, different behaviors, different culture. Everything about them is different language. Their calls are very different. So they are very distinct, even though they are classified as the same species. All right, just wanted to do a quick check. Everything going good in terms of technology? Going to assume that's a yes? Okay, yes. Perfect. Thank you. Yep. Excellent. All right, so before we kind of get into the threats and the what's going on with these orcas, I do want to mention the tribes in the area who consider orcas their relatives. They consider them their relation under the waves, and they have a very strong relationship with salmon and orcas, very much involved in salmon recovery, orca recovery. A lot of ceremonies take place for salmon and orcas. So I just kind of wanted to call that out because when we talk about the threats, I want to make sure that I mention that the tribes aren't responsible for this. It was everybody else. So I'm sure you're all fairly aware of this capture era that took place in the 1960s and 70s. Both residents and Biggs were captured, but primarily residents because they were at that time in bigger groups. They were kind of easier to get to in these inland waters here in the Salish Sea, which is where a lot of the captures took place. It's estimated that about one-third of the southern resident population was removed or killed during that time, and many of those were young whales. So we basically lost an entire generation. The captures have been illegal since 1976, thank goodness, but it's still having an impact on them today because we lost that generation. So it kind of put them into a genetic bottleneck. Once they go into captivity, as you probably know, they don't live nearly as long as they do in the wild. In the wild, their entire life cycle is almost identical to ours, and they can live as long as we do. But in captivity, the lifespan goes down to about 10 to 12 years on average. But this individual was the standout, or one of the standouts. So she was the last surviving southern resident orca in captivity. All the others had died by the 1990s. She spent 53 years at the Miami Seaquarium, and there were efforts to try to bring her back home out here and build a big sea pen for her, let her sort of retire in her native waters. And what was really amazing is that the Miami Seaquarium had sold, and the new owner was actually on board with this. So there were efforts to try to bring her home. Permits were being applied for, but unfortunately, Tokite did not survive to see that happen. She actually ended up dying last August. So that was kind of a sad ending to the capture era of the southern residents. Also want to call out this individual. This was a Biggs Orca, T46 or Wake. We also just lost her last year. And she was pretty famous around here. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to see her off the Oregon coast as well. But she was part of the very last capture to ever take place in Washington State. This took place near Olympia, and there were 6 Biggs orcas that were captured there, and there was a lot of public outcry at that time. So this capture actually ended up being the last capture. It led to it becoming illegal in Washington State because there was such an outcry. SeaWorld was actually sued, and the end result was that it became illegal and they ended up having to let these orcas go. So the 6 orcas who were captured then were released after several weeks. One of those was T46 or Wake, and these are all of the individuals that she has gone on to either give birth to or become the grandmother or great grandmother. So over 20, I think it's up to 28 individuals that never ever would have been born if that capture had taken place. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the impact one individual can have in a population. And if you think about all of the southern resident orcas that were taken, if they were still in the population today, what kind of an impact they could have had on this population. So just wanted to give a shout out to T46. She was a pretty special whale. All right, so we'll start with the southern resident population status and then kind of do a little comparison with Biggs. Historically, genetically, the estimate is that the population was 140 to 200 individuals. At the end of the capture era, by the time it became illegal, they were down to about 70. So they had been cut basically in half by the captures. The population started to rebound again, got up to about 98, 99 individuals, and then there was a steep decline in the 1990s, about 20%, almost 20% decline. That led to them being listed as endangered in both the United States and Canada. And the current population is listed at 73. I put a little asterisk there because there is an individual currently missing from K-Pod who has not been kind of added to the census yet. So the Center for Whale Research does their census on July 1st every year. So the number as of July 1st was 73, but once they update that census, which will happen sometime in January, it will go down to 72 because we are currently missing K26. He has not been seen in several encounters now. So K-Pod will be down to 14 individuals. Hopefully there will be another baby or two by the time they update that census, but if not, that number is going to go down to 72. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with what the threats are to southern residents. We have noise and disturbance, particularly from big shipping vessels. And of course, these orcas use echolocation. They need sound to be able to survive, to be able to find each other, to be able to find food. So noise and disturbance is a fairly big issue. I do want to mention, like a lot of people like to blame the whale watch boats. The whale watch boats in this area have been following rules and regulations for decades, and have been trying very hard to go along with whatever the science is saying in terms of what they should be doing for their speed and their distance. Recreational boaters, a lot of them don't know what to do, or if they do know what to do, they may not even know that orcas are there. So a lot of times it's just a matter of making sure that they're aware where the whales are and what they need to be doing. And then shipping, they are actually starting to work on that particular issue as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the recovery actions portion. Toxicants are a big issue. These are mostly chemicals that build up in the food chain all the way up to the orca, which is at the top. And so they biomagnify and become pretty detrimental by the time they get to that level in the orcas. So they can potentially suppress the immune system, the reproductive systems. And then, of course, not only is the prey that they're eating full of these toxics, but there's not enough of it. So you have an endangered species eating another endangered species. So those are kind of the three main threats that have been identified to southern residents. There are also a couple of other threats. One is the threat of oil spills. With shipping traffic increasing in this area, people are saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we have a huge oil spill. And just as an example of what can potentially happen with a catastrophic oil spill, I'm sure you all remember the Exxon Valdez. This particular group of transient orcas in Alaska, known as the AT1s, they actually swam right through the oil spill, and that population is now functionally extinct. It was always very small to begin with. I think it was only 28 or 26 individuals when that oil spill happened, but now they're down to 7 individuals, and none of them are reproductive females. So this population will go extinct, and it's a direct result of this oil spill. So it's a really big wake-up call that we need to make sure something like that doesn't happen here. Another big issue for southern residents is inbreeding. As we talked about, they went through this genetic bottleneck after the captures, and people have been starting to look at DNA. NOAA has done a number of DNA studies looking at paternity. And basically what they found is there is quite a bit of inbreeding going on. These 4 individuals in this picture are the 4 most inbred individuals in the population. And this one right here on the top right, J26, Mike, is the father, but also the brother of the one on the left. So he actually mated with his mother. So yeah, there is some inbreeding going on in this population. And what their models are suggesting is that if they remain genetically isolated, which we know they will because they don't mate outside their group, and the typical environmental conditions continue, then this population is going to continue to decline. So basically what that tells us is, no, this doesn't mean they're doomed. What it means is that we need to work even harder to repair these environmental conditions so that they can overcome this inbreeding. And this was a paper that just came out this year that was looking at extinction risk for southern residents. And it's quite honestly one of the most depressing things I've ever read. But basically what it's showing is they have a lower recovery potential than was previously estimated in previous models. So this is all done on modeling. It's predicting a more dramatic decline than prior models had predicted. And this is due to prey changes in their survival and fecundity, their ability to reproduce. And it's predicting a gradual decline of about 1% a year for roughly 2 generations, and then an accelerating decline that presages extinction. So again, super depressing, doesn't mean it's over, doesn't mean that's the end. It means we have a lot of work to do. It means we need to work a lot harder to make sure they have enough salmon so that this won't happen. All right, well, here's where things get really interesting, is looking at the bigs population. They have basically the same range as the southern residents. They're around the same amount of environmental factors, and yet they're absolutely thriving. So they're around the same amount of boat noise and shipping noise. Contaminants biomagnify in their bodies as well. In fact, their contaminant levels are actually higher than southern residents because they're eating higher on the food chain. The bigs orcas in this area are considered the most toxic marine mammals in the world, and yet they're absolutely thriving. They are doing so incredibly well. So what is the reason for that? Well, they have a lot of food. Their food is not declining. Their food is so abundant that they're able to overcome these other threats. So seals, sea lions, porpoises in this area are just thriving. So they have a lot of food. What we know with these toxicants that these southern residents have, or that all orcas have, is that they go into the blubber. They're what are called lipophilic. And so they go into the blubber layer. And sometimes they just sit there and not cause any problems. But if you don't have enough food, you tap into your blubber layer, you metabolize it, and then these toxicants go throughout your system. So what's happening with the big orcas is, yeah, they have a lot of these toxics, but they don't have to tap into their blubber because they have plenty of food. So basically, what they are showing us is yes, we have a lot of things to overcome with southern residents. We need to quiet the waters, we need to clean the waters. But if we can restore the salmon, they can overcome that. So that's really what we need to be concentrating on. So in terms of the salmon issue, this is a graph. The graph on the right was done by the Center for Whale Research. It ends in 2020, but it's kind of the same throughout if you continue going through the years. This is just basically showing salmon abundance as it compares to southern resident mortality. So salmon abundance is on the bottom, and all these different colors are different river systems. We don't need to go into detail on that, but this is coast-wide salmon abundance. It's not just looking at one river. And on the top is southern resident mortality. So the longer the line, the more mortalities there were that year. The shorter the line, fewer there were. And you can see there is a correlation. So when salmon abundance is higher, mortalities are lower. When a salmon abundance is lower, mortalities are higher. So direct correlation there between coast-wide salmon abundance and southern resident mortality. And then if you're looking at their food source, they need to eat a lot of food every day, depending on how big they are as an individual. And what has happened with salmon over the years is it has decreased in size, not just in number. So back in the day when salmon, big Chinook salmon may have been 80 to 100 pounds each, they could catch 3 or 4 of those in a day and be fine. Now the average size of salmon has decreased so much that it's maybe 18 to 20 pounds. And so they're having to expend a lot more energy to catch a lot more salmon in order to get the same number of calories. So that's something that is impacting them as well. All right, so we have a lot of things going on. We know what the issues are with these residents. What are we going to do about it? So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about some of the latest research that's been going on and some of the research findings that have taken place, and then talk a little bit about some of the recovery actions that have been going on. So I don't have time to really talk about all of the research. There's a lot of it out there, but I'll highlight a few programs. So I'm assuming most of you have probably heard of this one. It's pretty famous, been featured on BBC and all kinds of news outlets. So this is what used to be called the Conservation Canine Program through University of Washington is now the Southern Resident Killer Whale Health Monitoring Program through Wild Orca. And this is Dr. Deborah Giles and her husband Jim, and they are out there collecting orca poop because it's a gold mine of information. They do share the samples with NOAA where they can get DNA samples from that. And they can look at stress hormones, nutritional hormones, pregnancy hormones, find out exactly what the whales are eating, what the toxicant levels are. All of this comes out of poop. And of course, they have this adorable poop sniffing dog, Eva, and her job is to sniff it out so that they can successfully scoop it up. And then she gets to play with her toy. That's her big reward. So these are the 2 dogs who have done this job in the past. The one on the left is Tucker. He retired at about 11 years old. He was fantastic. And now Eva is the orca poop sniffing dog, and she is absolutely amazing. So, a couple of the research findings so far, they are looking at all kinds of different things right now. They're starting to look at some PFAS and see if those toxics are found in the scat. They're starting to do a lot more studies, but these are some of the published studies so far that this project has found. First of all, they found that stress hormones increase when food supply is low. They were looking at stress hormones. Most people thought it was going to be boats that was causing stress to increase, but it turned out to be lack of food. And what they're talking about here is chronic stress. So something that's going on a daily basis. And so this is a pretty huge issue that these animals are facing chronic stress when the food supply is low. And then that's impacting, is impacted by other things like toxics as well. The other thing they were looking at is pregnancy hormones. There have been a few, maybe 3-year periods where there were no surviving babies in the population. And at that time, nobody really knew for sure what was going on. Were they not getting pregnant or were they and losing the calves? Well, this study actually showed that they are indeed getting pregnant, but there was a 69% pregnancy loss, and that was linked to lack of food. And again, when you don't have enough food, you tap into your blubber, and that is probably impacting the fetus as well with those toxics going through the body. So these two things are showing us that, yes, salmon is a really big issue. We already knew that, but here's some data to show it. This is probably the most famous example of pregnancy loss that I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, were pretty aware of. There have been other instances of orcas carrying around dead calves, but this one just became famous because of how long it went on. So it was called a tour of grief. This was J35 Tahlequah. She gave birth to a calf that was either stillborn or only survived about a half hour. And then she spent the next 17 days carrying her calf's body for 1,000 miles out into the ocean, back into the Salish Sea. And this became international news. It was absolutely heartbreaking, but it really raised awareness. It made people become aware that if we don't do something, we're going to lose these orcas. And so recovery actions definitely increased after this took place. This is another project from SR3, and they are using drones to look at health and body condition. So here's J35 Tahlequah again. The picture on the left is her almost a year after the tour of grief is over, actually a little over a year after the tour of grief was over. And in that picture on the left, they said she looked in good body condition. So that was good news. We were kind of concerned about her. We assumed she had gone 17 days without eating when she was carrying her calf. So the fact that she was looking in good body condition was a really, really good news. Picture on the right, or next to that one, the one in the middle, that is her almost a year later, and she's looking pretty wide here in the middle. And so what they're saying here is she was pregnant again, which of course made us all a little bit nervous because of what she had gone through in the past. But here on the right, here she is about a month later with her new little calf. So that is J57 Phoenix. He's now 4 years old. He is absolutely thriving. He's huge. He's very playful, very active, doing incredibly well. So kind of a nice, happy ending to that story. Orca Behavior Institute is based here on San Juan Island, and what they are doing, they do study acoustics. I'll talk about that in a moment, but they're also taking a lot of this sighting data. So sighting data that comes from Orca Network, from the Whale Museum, from the Pacific Whale Watch Association, and they're kind of looking at all of it in terms of trends between southern residents and bigs and what's going on with where they're spending their time. Particularly looking at the Salish Sea and what's going on here. So in the past, it used to be that southern residents we would see almost every day between May through September, and the bigs would just wander in on occasion. Well, what this data is showing, and just from what we've been noticing and viewing ourselves, is that has completely changed. There's been a total shift in what's going on with these two populations. So the bigs orcas, there has been an 8-fold increase in sightings of them just in the last 10 years. And with southern residents, there's been a 76% drop in the last 20 years. So we're not seeing the southern residents during the summer at least, that May through September period, we are not seeing them nearly as often as we used to, whereas the bigs, we're seeing them pretty much every day. Southern residents are still spending time in Puget Sound. So again, like I mentioned, they just spent 28 days in Puget Sound and just left yesterday, which is kind of unprecedented. And there is a very strong chum run right now. And so that's the assumption is they were going after that chum. Another project that Orca Behavior Institute is working on with the Center for Whale Research. They were just down in Puget Sound for 2 weeks. In fact, yesterday was their last day on the water for that field season. So they're working together where Center for Whale Research is flying a drone over the orcas and looking at behaviors. And Orca Behavior Institute is listening to hydrophones. And what they're going to do is try to match up behaviors with calls and see if there's any kind of understanding there about what certain calls are being used during certain behaviors. And this would be really interesting to know, but it also might help in terms of when hydrophones are picking orcas up off the coast, could that be matched to certain behaviors? Could we, say from that, okay, they were heard off this hydrophone and they were making these particular calls or lack thereof, and maybe that means that they're foraging, or are they transiting through the area? Are they being, social and surface active? So a lot can be basically discerned from how they're behaving and how they're calling. So we'll just kind of have to see how this works out. This was their first year taking this data. Again, they just finished 2 weeks on the water yesterday, so we'll see what they find out. They do plan on doing this again next year. They got a 2-year grant for this study. Stay tuned on this one. And then for the Center for Whale Research, partnering with University of Exeter, they are the ones who do the census on Southern residents. So how many individuals are in the population, who's no longer there, who has a new baby. And they've been doing this since 1976. They're also looking at behaviors and social networking, who's hanging out with who, what their social structure is. And a couple of things that they have found out through looking at all of this data is that the grandmothers are really, really important. We kind of always sort of guess that, but we do know they have the data on this to show that they are important to the survival of calves. Calves who have a grandmother do better. So they're probably helping to babysit, they're passing on ecological knowledge. They also found that orcas have friends. They have certain individuals, if you get, the pods coming together, there are individuals that like to hang out together, and they are most often of the same sex and same age class. So they have friends, just like we do. And prey sharing happens. Scientists have known for a long time that these orcas shared their prey. They don't just catch a salmon and eat it, they catch it and share it with other individuals. It was always assumed that they were sharing with their immediate family members. But what they're actually finding with some drone studies is that they're sharing sometimes with individuals they're not even closely related to, which is very, very interesting and heartwarming as well. So I do have a video that I'm going to show you of prey sharing. So this is from a video project called Salmon Stories, and this particular one was from the Center for Whale Research having to do with prey sharing. And so this is a clip from that, and it's narrated by Michael Weiss, the research director of Center for Whale Research, who's kind of explaining what's going on in this video. So hopefully this will all work well, and I will go ahead and get it started.
The question of kind of why you would share outside of your close kin circle when you yourself might not have enough fish is a really interesting one. I mean, I think it's the same reason we help our friends, right? If you have social relationships and you care about those other, your friends and your family, you're going to share with them, maybe even especially when times are hard, right? There were two moments of prey sharing this last year that I think were the most surprising for me. The first, in the moment, we were watching the L54 subgroup. So that's L54, her two sons, and then an unrelated adult male. First, we just had L54 and her two sons traveling together, and we didn't know where the big guy was. And then we see this, big shape of a whale coming up with a big fish in his mouth, and we notice him biting it in half. The biggest part goes to L54, kind of the matriarch. She takes it, she breaks that part even further up, and some of that goes back to her two sons. So we have this kind of chain of sharing, starting with this adult male and ending with these two younger males. This was surprising in the moment for us. He is not related to these three other whales. He travels with them. They're his main social group, but he's not related to them. The second one, this adult female, shares a fish with J51 and J58. And we're like, oh, that's really lovely. You know, that's a mom catching a fish and then sharing it with her two kids. Only to go back and rewatch the footage later and realize that wasn't J41 sharing, that was J22. The whale, again, not related to these two young whales. She did, honestly, the majority of the work. She took that fish and then shared it with those two, despite especially the youngest whale there, J58, kind of messing up the hunt as it was happening. It felt like a really special moment to be there for. You know, this whale taking the time to, you know, use her experience to help out two younger kids and make sure they get some food.
All right, so that's just kind of a snapshot of some of the really incredible research that's going on. So now I'll just kind of spend a little bit of time talking about recovery efforts and what's going on there. The Southern Resident Orca Task Force took place in 2018 and 2019 in Washington State. That was something that was started by Governor Inslee, and this group met for 2 years, and they came up with 49 recommendations on what they think needs to be done to help the Southern residents recover. So I actually took a little bit of time and broke it down, which was a really good exercise for me too. There is a website called orca.wa.gov where you can go and get a lot more information on all of this, but they list all of the recommendations and where they're at with those. And so the 49 recommendations, was the breakdown. There were 16 of them on prey, 12 on vessels, 10 on contaminants, 5 on climate change, and 6 additional that had to do with population growth, and funding and monitoring the progress of these recommendations. So that's kind of the breakdown of where the recommendations fell. And then here is where they are with those. So 35 of those are underway. So at least some work has been done on those. 6 of those are pending, meaning they haven't started yet, but still maybe plan to. There was one that they said needs improvement, and I'm not exactly sure what that means. 2 are inactive, meaning they are not planning to pursue those, and 6 of them have been completed. So 6 of the 49 recommendations have been completed since 2019. Here is kind of what has been completed. One of the really good things that came out of this is there was a new position created in Washington State for an orca recovery coordinator. That wasn't something that we had before. We had a salmon recovery coordinator, but not an orca. So that's a new position that has been created. So that was a good thing. The Quiet Sound program is a really great program that is trying to mitigate impacts of shipping in Puget Sound. So that's the one I had talked about earlier, where our sighting network actually reports to them every 15 minutes when Southern residents are around. And when that information is in the system, it goes out to any of the shipping traffic, the ferries, so that they can slow down when the orcas are around. There is some research that's showing that if you slow down, it creates less noise. And so this is kind of a sister program to one that was started up in British Columbia called the ECHO program. They started ECHO first. They were doing some slowdowns in Harrow Strait, which runs between Washington and British Columbia. And then this is kind of the sister program in Puget Sound. So that is something that came out of the task force as well. There was also a stakeholder process to discuss Snake River dams. So what this process is let's talk about what needs to happen in terms of mitigation if we take these dams down. So what do we need to do to take care of the people who rely on these dams? So that stakeholder process did take place. So that is marked as complete. There was some whale watching permitting and regulations, and the newest regulation goes into effect in January. And that is where everybody, whale watching boats and recreational boats, need to stay a half mile away from Southern residents. The original regulations and permitting was just for whale watch boats. So whale watch boats had to stay half mile away, but everybody else could be 300 yards, which didn't make a whole lot of sense. So, like it or not, now it's a half mile for everybody, but at least it's consistent. And of course, there are some exemptions to that for shipping traffic and ferries. But the ferries do an incredible job of trying to make sure that they, stop and give the whales the right of way. They did that a lot in Puget Sound over the last 28 days. There were some standards for stormwater funding that came out of this and a permit framework for wastewater treatment. So those are the things that have been completed in the task force. Obviously, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Some of the other recovery actions that are taking place in British Columbia, they have some vessel regulations. They're doing fisheries closures when Southern residents show up in the area. They have some contaminants management they're working on and working on Fraser River recovery. So those are some things happening in British Columbia. Obviously, Oregon is doing great things as well. Lots of volunteer programs, including ACS, Oregon Whale Watch, Oregon Shores, lots of protection and monitoring going on, and a new state endangered listing. So way to go on that one. We were all very excited about it and supported it. So that's great. I can't wait to see, what comes out of that in terms of what actions are going to take place. There's also Orca Action Month in June, which takes place in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. Lots of nonprofit organizations, as well as some governmental organizations, really taking that month to really, turn up the volume in terms of public education and action. And then Orca Salmon Month, which includes Orca Recovery Day, takes place in October in Washington. So that's, again, a snapshot. There's a lot of recovery efforts going on with a lot of different organizations, but that just gives you an idea of kind of where we are with the task force and what some of the other actions are that are taking place. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about where we are with dams. The Elwha River dams in Washington State, that was a huge success. Those came down many years ago, and salmon started coming back almost right away. So that was a huge success. They are starting to see a lot more Chinook salmon going through those river systems up to the spawning grounds. So very happy about that one. I'm sure you are all very aware of this one as well. Klamath River dams just came down just at the end of August is when that river was finally running free again after more than 100 years. And less than 2 months later, there was Chinook salmon seen in a tributary above the dams in Oregon. So that's how quickly they were able to get back to those spawning grounds. Just kind of goes to show that if you create it, the salmon know what to do. We don't have to teach them how to get back up to their spawning grounds. It's actually ingrained in them. They know exactly what to do if you just get the things out of the way. Snake River dams, ongoing battle. As I mentioned, there was that stakeholder process that took place. We have had lawmakers who have said, yes, in order to recover salmon, those dams are going to have to go. What they have also said is before we can take those dams down, we need to make sure that we mitigate for that we take care of the people who rely on them, that we have an alternate means of irrigation and transportation. What we haven't gotten to yet is getting started on that. We know what needs to happen, so let's figure out how to get the funding for it and let's get it started. And that's kind of where we're stalled right now. In the middle of all these dam removal projects and efforts, we also need to stop new dams from being built. And there is a dam being proposed on the Chehalis River in southern Washington. This is not for irrigation or electricity. This is for mitigation for floods. The Chehalis River does flood on a regular basis, as all good rivers do. It's what they do naturally, but a lot of people built in the floodplain. And so now homes are being destroyed, businesses are being destroyed when you get these big catastrophic floods, which are increasing because of climate change. So the answer is we're going to build a dam that would not be operating all the time. It would only be operating during catastrophic floods. But there would be a big environmental footprint to build this dam. So there's a lot of opposition to this, including the two tribes that are in the area, the Chehalis and the Quinault. And there's a big coalition called the Chehalis River Alliance that Orca Network is part of. trying to stop this dam from going in. So there's a lot more detail on that I won't go into right now, but it is an ongoing battle. They have done some environmental impact statements. The final on the national environmental impact statement, the federal one, is due at the end of 2025, and then it will be, depending on where that falls, then the state one will be coming out shortly after that. So lots of people working on trying to stop that dam from being built. The salmon in the Chehalis River are not currently listed as endangered, but they have been declining. And there is a petition right now to list them as endangered. It would list the Washington coast salmon as Chinook salmon as endangered, and this would include the Chehalis River. All right, so I kind of just want to leave you with this thought. What will we lose if we lose the southern resident orcas? I actually get asked this a lot, believe it or not. We have other orcas here, right? The big orcas are thriving, they're doing really well. So if we lose the southern residents, we'll still have orcas. But it's a lot more complicated than that, as we all know, right? They're genetically distinct, they're culturally distinct, they have their own society, their own culture. And so we would lose a lot more than just population of orcas. And this is kind of a famous statement that came from Alexandra Morton, that if we lose them, it will be the first extinction where every individual's name was known, which is kind of sobering if you think about that. But the good news is we're not there yet, right? There's still a lot that we can do. We're not out of time. We can definitely still recover this population. There is a lot of hope. These are all the babies who were born since 2019. Even with that high miscarriage rate, all of these individuals have been born since 2019. Unfortunately, not all of them survived. We did lose the last two. So J60, who was born last December, survived less than a month. And then L128, who was just born in September, also did not survive. So we did lose a couple of them, but the rest of these guys are all still alive. They all seem to be doing really well. They seem to be thriving. So that's really good news. What this meant is their mothers were able to find enough food to successfully give birth and to feed them. So this gives us a lot of hope. They're doing what they need to do. As long as we continue to do our part and continue with these recovery actions, making sure they have enough salmon, they still can recover. I don't probably need to go through all of this with you because I'm sure you're already doing these things. But just in terms of general public, lots of things people can do, reducing their carbon footprint. We know climate change is having a huge impact on salmon, planting rain gardens, reducing plastics and chemicals. You're already volunteering and supporting organizations that are doing great work. So I don't need to go through that in detail with all of you. I know I'm talking to the choir, but that's just some general things that people can do if they want to help. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then I would love to have a conversation with as much time as people have. So are there any questions to start with, and then we can kind of go from there.
Thank you, Cindy. That was excellent. So you can either put questions in the chat or you can feel free to unmute and just ask questions. One thing I would just like to mention to our members is that Michael Weiss with the Center for Whale Research was one of our Oregon chapter's first grant recipients. It was a very small grant. It was the very first year of our chapter. And it's so heartwarming to me to see the students that we help go on and do amazing, great things.
I did not know that. That's very exciting. I'm really happy to hear that. Yeah, he's doing amazing work with the Center for Whale Research. So I hope that there was some new information in there for you. It wasn't things that you already knew. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful. And it's always good to look at cool videos of orcas too from a drone.
Yes, it is. And for myself, I appreciated seeing what kind of progress has been made that came out of the governor's task force. because there was a lot of publicity when the task force was meeting, but then afterwards, there was kind of not much information shared about what was going on other than the whale watch regulations. That was the only thing I really saw.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The whale watching was kind of a big thing. It got a lot of media around it. And so a lot of people came out of it thinking, well, nothing else has happened. So there have been some other things that happened. Progress has been really slow. I would like to see more things happening, but at least there are some things that are ongoing in terms of salmon habitat and those types of things. So, yeah.
I would like to say something. I totally agree with you about the need for education and research. That's always needed. But do you know who Andy Kerr is?
No.
He started Oregon Wild way back in early years. It was called a different organization. And he now lives in Joseph, Oregon. And he has a blog where he mainly deals with legislation and federal proposals that are coming forth and what's wrong with what's being proposed and stuff. But in his latest edition, he mentioned something that I thought was important in that he was going to stop contributing to 503c three organizations, which are tax deductible, and start contributing to the four 503c4 organizations, which are the front line of going to courts, those type of organizations who fight when it's not enough to educate people, not enough to lobby, legislators, but you have to go to court. And I think with the new administration, that's going to be happening. We need to be doing a lot more of that. And so I thought that was a wise contribution.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of people don't realize the difference between a 501c3 and a 501c4. 501c3 is education, they can advocate, but 501c4s are really more focused on action. So they're the ones who are litigating, think of NRDC if you're familiar with them. They're litigating to, stop Navy sonar, for example. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a place for both. Obviously, education and research are really important to inform about what's going on out there, but the action is going to be incredibly important, particularly as we move into this next administration. So, yeah, I think it's very, very important to support these organizations for sure.
And those organizations also work with 501c3 organizations. We have formed a coalition for the whale entanglement issue. It includes NRDC, it includes CBD, it includes Earth Justice, it includes Oceana, along with other nonprofits, including the ACS, to come together to meet. And one of the things that comes out of that is then we can bring back to our members, here's a letter you can send out. Here's something here's what we've signed on to. So I can see definitely the need for both. And especially with the incoming administration, I can see where a lot more legal action is going to be necessary. I looked at some statistics from that were put out talking about NRDC, and I think it might have been Earth Justice, about how many lawsuits they brought during the former administration when Trump was the president, and how many of those they successfully were able to win. So I think we do have our work cut out for us coming ahead. I do have a comment here from Eddie. I was going to ask about L128. Sad to hear of her mortality. I was on San Juan Island when it was born, and the island was so excited about the birth, and it had been already added to the family tree at the Whale Museum.
Yeah. So those of you who didn't hear kind of the ending of that story, so L128 was born in September. The mother was L90, who was 31 years old. She had already had multiple miscarriages that we know of. So this was her first successful birth. So everybody was so excited. And what was really interesting, though, is that all three pods, I don't think it was every member of all three pods, but all three pods were in around San Juan Island. Everybody took off and went west, and she and the baby stayed behind by themselves, which was unusual. Not completely unprecedented, but certainly unusual. But the calf looked healthy, the mom looked healthy. They got a drone over them. They said they looked okay. So we have a lot of hope that things were going to be all right. They did end up going back out west and joining up with everybody else. Somebody from Center for Whale Research went out there to an area called Swift Shore Bank, where they tend to hang out off the coast there and feed. And they saw L90, the mom, not with the calf. The calf was with a different female from L pod, and the calf was probably in its, potentially last hours of life. It was looking very, very poorly. The other female was kind of pushing it a little bit, actually came right up next to their boat. And so then the next time that those whales were seen, the calf was not there. And the calf has not been seen since. So the calf did not survive, unfortunately, which was incredibly sad. But yeah, that's the end of that sad story. And I do want to actually comment on what you said as well, Joy, about I think you definitely called it in terms of working together in coalitions. I think those are going to be so, so important. We have a coalition called the Orca Salmon Alliance that includes a lot of nonprofits that are education focused, advocacy focused, research focused, but it also includes some of the 501c4s like NRDC, CBD, Earth Justice. And yeah, I mean, we work together on comment letters, talking about issues, trying to comment on anything orca, salmon, toxics related. So I think those are incredibly important. And we just had Oregon Shores join as well, which is exciting because we definitely want some more Oregon representation there. So I'm definitely interested in hearing what you guys are all up to, and if there's any ways that we can work together to support each other. Definitely interested in that. I think it's going to be super important in the coming years.
Does anyone else want to jump in and comment?
Yeah, I have a comment and a little bit of a question. I'm curious about the contamination up in Salish Sea and Puget Sound, talking about the PCBs. In another lifetime, I was a hazmat tech with a fire department, and we dealt with PCBs a lot, mainly with electrical transformers. And I lost a friend after about 15 years from an incident we were involved in from his contamination with it. Are we still seeing a lot of contamination runoff up there, or is it slowly subsiding, but realizing the half-life and everything that it could still be quite a while before it's gone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So PCBs are still out there. Like you said, the half-life is pretty long. It doesn't go away. So they're still out there. But I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Ross. He studies toxicology, particularly in orcas. He's up in British Columbia. He gave a talk back in June that was really fascinating. And what he said is the PCB levels are actually decreasing in southern residents. But unfortunately, they're being replaced by other things, right? So PBDEs, which are flame retardants, are in pretty high levels. They're showing higher levels of PFAS and some of these other contaminants. So some are decreasing, some are on the increase. So it's just like this constant turnover of chemicals out there. And runoff is the number one issue, of how they're getting into the Salish Sea. But Peter Ross's talk was absolutely fascinating. So if anybody's interested in watching that, I can send a link to Joy and send it out to you guys.
That would be
Cindy,
great.
do you know anything about the benefits seen yet by getting rid of some of the armoring of the shores and other things to improve the forage fish environment around the Salish Sea?
Yeah, that's a really good question in terms of forage fish. And I don't know if anybody has any specific numbers yet on how forage fish are doing. I know they're doing some studies. There may be some newer study results out there that I'm not familiar with, but um, anecdotally, it seems like there is a lot of forage fish out there. And one of the reasons we can say that fairly safely is because of how well all the other marine mammals are doing in the Salish Sea. Like everything except the southern residents is absolutely thriving, and a lot of these animals eat forage fish. Like if you look at humpback whales, for example, they're eating both forage fish and krill, but the humpback whale explosion in the Salish Sea it's just crazy. Like, just since the 1990s, we went from no individual humpbacks to over 1,000 who have been identified within the Salish Sea. And they're eating forage fish. So obviously there has to be a lot of it there. So yeah, I don't know exact numbers, but it does seem like the forage fish population, at least at the moment, is doing fairly well.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think that Oregon could use help with is looking at, so we were able to get the southern residents onto the Oregon endangered species list, but the next step is looking at what kind of plan they're going to come up with and making sure that this is going to be a good solid plan that will benefit the southern residents. It was interesting during the meeting with the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission when it was discussed to be voted on, was that some of the folks from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife that were presenting didn't seem to know a lot about orcas or the southern residents. So I think that's something that we'll be looking for help with.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's any ways that, the Orca Salmon Alliance can help support those efforts, we did send a letter in support of listing them. So if there's anything that we can do moving forward, I know we have some of our members with the Orca Salmon Alliance have been part of that effort. So yeah, just let us know.
Thank you.
I think you're aware of that. We had a sighting of the offshores in Depot Bay back in September. There was a group of them came. They were inside right around Half Mile Buoy.
I did hear that. That was pretty amazing.
And it kind of shocked everybody out there. Orcas,
Yeah.
okay, orcas, yeah, all right. And then when they got the IDs, it kind of blew people's minds.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking. Well, thanks for all the great work you're doing, all your education and advocacy work, and for orcas and gray whales, my other favorite. So really appreciate ACS.
Oh, Cindy, would you like to mention anything about Orca Network's trip to see the gray whales? I've had people ask about whale watching trips.
Oh, yeah. So Orca Network does do a trip, two of them actually in March, down to San Ignacio Lagoon to see the gray whales. There's one that is a 5-day trip that goes to the lagoon and back, staying at a place called Campo Cortez, which is a wonderful family-owned camp. And then the other one is a 7-day trip, maybe a little bit longer, that includes not just the lagoon, but also a few days in Loretto to go out and hopefully try to see blue whales, humpback whales. So if anybody is interested in those, they are on our Facebook page and on our website. So, and I personally worked at Laguna San Ignacio as a naturalist for 20 years, and it is an absolutely magical place. So just kind of sad my last few years there just because the UME was going on and we weren't seeing as many whales. And so that was kind of a sad thing to witness, but hopefully they're going to start coming back strong now.
Yeah, one of the things that we noticed this year was here along the Oregon coast, we were not seeing as many gray whales this year as we had last year. Seemed like it also seemed like maybe we didn't have some of the good conditions. We weren't seeing a lot of good kelp beds. Seemed like those came later. And for the first time in 12 years, our summer whale watch weekend had 0 gray whales. And so it was pretty disappointing. The good thing was it seems like later in the season, August, September, we saw more whales finally show up. But yeah, it was kind of a disappointing year this year for gray whale sightings.
Sad. Yeah, that's sad. I think, one thing to keep in mind with the unusual mortality event is, yeah, it's been declared over because it's based on mortalities, right? So if the mortalities are back to normal, then the UME is over, but it doesn't mean that the population's recovered, right? So they're still having really low calf counts down in Baja. Last year was the lowest calf count on record. So even though the UME is officially declared over, it's going to take them some time to catch up because, the last 4 or 5 years have been very, very low calf counts. So I think we're still going to see, a number of years with low numbers of whales until they start to recover from this.
Yeah, I know during the whale watch week last year with the state parks, we saw our lowest numbers ever. Since I've been doing it 15 years, and that's the lowest I've ever seen. I think in the spring we saw 30 whales, and we were out there for 9 days. And normally we would see around 100 to 120 in a 9-day cycle.
Wow.
So we saw 30. This summer doing ID photos for CRC along the central coast here. I had, up until August, I think I had 28 whales. That was it. September was kind of a flourish there, and I sent Allie 71 whales the other day. But 2023, I sent her 156. So
Wow.
shows the difference in what we saw this summer.
Yeah.
And
Well, I also heard that they're kind of a little bit later. The migration was a little bit later. Maybe they were staying longer up in the feeding grounds.
Yeah.
But yeah, that could have impacted things as well.
That was interesting because I texted folks I know up in Washington and down in Northern California, seeing if they were seeing whales. Maybe our whales that we see every summer were in other locations, and nobody was seeing them in any numbers. And Marine Mammal Institute here in Newport, talking with Lisa, she says they were going out and they weren't seeing them either. We had one case for about 2 months this summer where whale watch boats were seeing 1 whale a day, and it turned out it was the same whale. We had the same whale. It was a 2-year-old whale. We all know it was out there for like 2 months, and they would see the same whale every day. So it wasn't
Wow.
even a different whales coming through like normal.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we've had, here in Puget Sound, we have the Sounders gray whales, a small population that show up every spring. And we had some of them that stayed year round or one that stayed year round and others that showed up really early and probably did not migrate down to Baja, chose to come in and eat instead. So they're spending a lot more time here than they used to, and which is a good thing because there's food here for them. So, why go down to Baja if you're starving? Why not just find food instead? So I was really actually very glad to see that. But yeah, definitely some changes going on.
Oh yeah, we had a couple of the whales hung out all winter. They wintered over here. We weren't seeing them on the Central Coast, but I had people talk to that said they saw them down maybe as Northern California. And then the whale would be the first one we see back this spring. And it was a young whale, 2-year-old whale that called Pepper. And I saw it was the last whale I saw in 2023, the week after Thanksgiving, feeding off Boiler Bay. And it was the first whale I saw this spring feeding, and it was at Rocky Creek, so 2 miles apart.
Must have been nice to see him though, and know
Yeah,
that
oh, it
they're
was
still
to
hanging in there.
see that it made
It's
it through the
great.
year. Uh,
Yeah.
but it was kind of disappointing. A lot of the whales that we know that have been here, coming back here for the last 20, 30 years, we didn't see a lot of those this summer, which was kind of strange. People wondered where they went. And of course, visitors out here, you're trying to show them whales, and you got the whale ID catalog there, hoping to see a whale that now they can look in the book and they actually take ownership now with this whale that they just saw, and we can't see any. We're not seeing any, and that made it
Yeah,
really tough.
I bet.
And it was interesting though, because threw out some ideas. Are we seeing a lack of food? What's going on out here? Is the temperature warmer? The ocean temperature, and looked at some of the buoy temperatures out there. And yeah, they were warm early, but they cooled off really fast. Got down to normal fairly quick. And then the fishing captains were reporting that the fish they were catching were full of mice and shrimp. So it wasn't like there wasn't anything to eat out there. And that was the surprise thing to me.
Yeah, so there's food, but the whales just aren't there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and the population declined by 46%. That we're going to expect that, right?
Yeah, we were talking with Allie up there at CRC. She does the whale catalog for the gray whales.
Mhm.
And she said that they hadn't reported any in the mortality, none have washed ashore that they could identify out of the Pacific Coast feeding group, that small group of whales. They did
right.
say that there were 2 sounders that haven't shown up now for the last several years that they believe were lost. So, I believe that we could have lost some of our whales in that easily. That unfortunately they sank. They didn't come ashore and wouldn't be identified. The fact that only 10% come ashore is a big deal. So
Right,
it makes
right.
it hard to figure out who you lost and who you didn't lose.
Yeah.
Well, just a closing thought. I think we're pretty lucky in Oregon and Washington and California that even though in the next administration it's going to be hard to get things done federally on a state level, I think we're in a good position, right?
Yeah.
We have legislators who care. And so I think that if we can try to concentrate on doing things on a state level for orcas, gray whales, the environment, salmon, not all is going to be lost. I think it's going to be challenging, but we're very fortunate to live in the states that we do. And we're very fortunate that these whales are, traveling off the West Coast with states where we might be able to get some things done. So that's something to hang on to.
Yeah, well, we call Depot Bay the whale watch capital of the world only because you can see more whales from shore here than pretty much anywhere else. I mean, we're talking big whales. I've seen blues, humpbacks, says, minkies, fins, and 90% of the time gray whales. So, I mean, and they're close. I've been hit with blows standing on shore twice. So
I need to get back down there. I've only been there once, but I really need to get back down there. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your comment there. That does, give us some hope is working here in our states. And, now that they've taken the southern residents as an Oregon endangered species, we have the opportunity to do work there.
Yeah. Yeah. And the more we can all work together, the better.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated this. And Eddie said, thank you for the great presentation and educational information. And it was great to get an update on the Southern residents. And Dolores said, thank you for all the work you do. So,
Well,
it's
thank
very
you. Thanks for having me.
appreciated. Thank you.
You bet. We'll talk again soon, hopefully. Thanks for all the great work you're doing.